He was supposed to serve and protect. Worked as a police officer for the City of Doraville Police Department. Also a member actively of the United States military and the National Guard. He took an oath to serve. And he took an oath to protect. He took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and of the state of Georgia. He took an oath to uphold all of the laws. He is one of the people that we should trust to enforce the law. Somebody we should hold to a higher standard because of his role in enforcing the law. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he abused the law. And he used his badge and he used his position to satisfy his own sexual desires. He is a cop who turned into a killer. His victim, 16-year-old Susana Morales. Susana was in high school. This is her at her quinceañera, her 15th birthday. Not long after this, her life was taken and snuffed out by the defendant. He was supposed to serve and protect his community. He served as a courtesy officer for the Sterling Glen Apartments. He lived in Gwinnett County in Norcross in the Sterling Glen Apartments and worked in the city of Doraville as a police officer. But while there at the apartment complex, he was a courtesy officer, which you'll hear is very common in apartment complexes and neighborhoods where police officers will serve to help protect, help police the area to make sure that nothing bad is happening at the apartment complexes. Not only did he have an obligation to the citizens of the state of Georgia and the city of Doraville, the United States military, he took on the obligation of being a courtesy officer at the Sterling Glen Apartments, where he was supposed to serve. He was supposed to protect. You'll hear from police officers, you're never off duty. You're never not supposed to follow the law and uphold the law. But instead of doing that, at the Sterling Glen Apartments, he abused his power. And Susana Morales, on the night of July 26, 2022, her precious life ended because of the defendant's desire to satisfy his own sexual desires. July 26th of 2022 for Susana was the last day she breathed a breath on this planet. That day, you'll hear that she lived right behind the Sterling Glen Apartments. This is the entrance to the Sterling Glen Apartments on Indian Trail Road. We talked about the intersection there at Singleton Road and Indian Trail Road. Sterling Glen Apartments are located right here at that intersection of Indian Trail and Singleton Road. You were going to hear that the defendant lived in this building back here on the back side of the property. And Susana lived on a road right behind here. Susana had friends that lived in the Sterling Glen Apartments. You're going to hear from them, hopefully today. You're going to hear from her friend Kelly and her friend Alyssa. They lived at the Sterling Glen Apartments in different apartment buildings near the defendant. And on that night, July 26th of 2022, Susana told her mother that she was going to go hang out at her friend's house. Asked her mom. She told her mom she was going to hang out at her friend Rose's house. Rose is, her name is Esmeralda Castillo, but she goes by the name Rose. Her mom knew Rose, knew her family, and agreed to let Susana go. But like many teenagers, Susana wasn't being truthful with her mom about where she was going. She wasn't going to Rose's house, and you'll hear Rose lives just across Singleton Road. within a 5-minute walk from Susanna's house. So Susanna's mom let her walk to Rose's house. But she didn't go to Rose's house, she went over to the Sterling Glen Apartments, where she spent time with her friends Kelly and Alyssa. You'll see some photographs from that night. You'll hear from them about what happened. That night, with her friends, they sat out on Alyssa's doorstep, listening to music, they smoked marijuana together, they spent the evening together, and had a great night. Nothing happened. There were no issues. They were having fun. And then Susanna decided needed to leave at around 10 p.m. And you'll hear from Kelly that Kelly walked her from her apartment, or from Alyssa's apartment. Alyssa Marvin lives right here in this building. And Alyssa Kelly and Alyssa and Susanna were here in this building. And Kelly walked with Susanna to the exit up here on Singleton Road. Right here, there's an exit from the apartment complex on Singleton Road. And you'll hear that Kelly walked her to that exit, said goodbye to her around 10 p.m., and watched as Susanna walked down Singleton Road. You'll see here the exit, and Susanna began her trip back down Singleton Road. Her road is Santa Ana Drive, and it's right just outside of this picture. There's a business here, King David Academy, and it captured the last images of Susana Morales' life as she walked home to her mom's house around 10 p.m. That is the last time anyone but the defendant saw her alive. The next thing that happened is she didn't come home. She never made it back to her mother's house. No one ever heard from her again. Not a single text message, not a phone call, nothing. She disappeared from life after that moment. What next happened at about 10:29, about 29 minutes later, Susanna had Life 360. She had that application on her phone, and you'll hear about that application. You'll hear that she shared her location with a friend of hers named Kaya Jones. Kaya and her were close and friends and part of a friend group, and they would share each other's location all day. And at 10:29 p.m., Kaya received this text message that said, Life 360 detected sudden motion on her phone, on Susanna's phone. Could be the result of a collision, hard braking, or dropped phone. We called it crash alert. And Kaya became concerned. What happened? As any good friend would do. So she started calling and texting Susanna. No answer. And what she realized when she looked at the Life 360 was that Susanna was no longer traveling down Singleton Road towards her home. Instead, she was traveling at 40 miles per hour down Singleton, across Indian Trail, and onto Steve Reynolds Boulevard at 40 miles an hour. And you'll hear from the detectives, I believe her being in a vehicle at that point. Her phone and her are traveling down Steve Reynolds Road before a crash alert occurs at the intersection of Steve Reynolds Boulevard and Oak Block Trace. There's an apartment complex there. Kaya, concerned for her friend, not being able to get in touch with her, calls Rose. Have you heard from her? No. Rose calls Susanna's boyfriend. Have you heard from her? No. Nobody's heard from her. Nobody knows where she's at. You'll hear from all her friends. None of them got text messages from her. None of them received any phone calls. No calls for help, no distress, just vanished off the face of the planet after 10:29 p.m. when her phone made a crash alert. And you'll hear her phone remained at that location until it died. Her phone never moved from that area And you'll hear from everybody who canvassed, her friends, the police, everyone. Searched the entire area. Found no trace of her. They did not locate her phone. It's a busy area there on Stephen Boulevard. They did not locate her phone. They never found it. But it died at that location, and she wasn't there. And you'll hear from the detectives. They believe her phone was thrown from her vehicle at that time. Thrown from a vehicle at that time. She did not drive. She didn't have a vehicle. She wasn't driving. She was in somebody else's vehicle. And we're going to argue to you, and you see evidence, that it was the defendant's vehicle. At that point, she was in his vehicle, and her phone got thrown out of her vehicle. 16-year-old high school girl, and her phone is separated from her and stays there until it dies. That area right there on Oak Block Trace looks just like that. There are some townhomes there, Steve Reynolds Boulevard, and you'll hear from her friends who looked through the whole apartment complex, found no trace of her. Through all the roads, the woods, the rivers, the creek beds, everywhere, nothing. You'll hear from the police. There was no crash that night. No reported crash of any kind that occurred that night. And after that moment, nobody heard from her again. Her mother, her sisters, they didn't hear from her. And it was day after day after day with absolutely no word. You'll hear about the police investigation, where they looked, what they did, trying to find Susanna. Ultimately, with absolutely zero results. Not a single lead, no messages from her, no calls from her, no text to any friends, nothing. She vanished off the face of the planet after that moment. But what you'll hear is that her family had to endure 196 days of no information. 4,704 hours of absolutely no idea where their daughter was, where their sister was. 282,240 minutes. 16,934,400 seconds. Second after second of a mother having no idea where her child is. Not knowing what happened to her, where she went, who took her, what happened to her. Terror for that family. Second after second after second. Until February 6th of 2023. On February 6th of 2023, what you're going to hear is that a man named Matthew Gilbert was driving down Highway 316 and pulled off on the side of Highway 316. He saw this trail that is right off the side of Highway 316. At that time, it was February, it was winter, there were no leaves on the trees, and it was pretty obvious like this. But in the summertime, you'll see that this area here is completely wooded. You can't even see the pathway, but in February, he was able to see the pathway. And it's a small little path. It's not even a road, it's just a pathway. And he had a little off-road vehicle, and he decided to go off-roading on the side of 316. And he drove down, got out of his vehicle, was walking around, when he stumbled across something that he'll never forget. In this area, right here on the side of Highway 316. This is in Decula, Georgia. The intersection right here, kind of in the middle of this map, is Drowning Creek Road. To the right is towards Athens, and towards the left is back towards Lawrenceville. But in the middle of the woods, on that day, Mr. Gilbert stumbled across human remains. And at that moment, he stopped. You'll hear from him. He'll tell you what he found. And he called the police. I found a human remains in the woods. It's unusual to find human remains in the woods. And he called the police, and the police showed up, and they started to investigate. The medical examiner came out. Crime scene specialist came out. Detectives came out. And they started looking into who could this possibly be. And you're going to hear that very quickly they identified these remains as that of Susana Morales. You're going to hear from the medical examiner, compared with dental records. You're going to hear that right there with these remains, or skeletal remains, they found her fingernails, still with the black nail polish she had painted on them. She had hair that was dark on the top, with blonde hair on the bottom. They found her hair still there. But what you're going to hear is that they found nothing else. They found no flesh, no tissue. She was completely skeletal. There was no forensic evidence to really pull from it because it had been 196 days since she went missing. She wasn't buried. Her body was dumped there in the woods. And you're going to hear very importantly that she was naked. Her body was left there in the woods, completely naked. They found absolutely not one shred of any fiber, any clothing, any socks, any pants, any shirt, any undergarments, anything. Her body was dumped naked in the woods. What is significant, the medical examiner who's responsible for performing autopsies conducted what she could of an autopsy on the remains of Susana and found no cause of death. What does that mean? There was no obvious signs of trauma to her skeleton. Right? There was no obvious bullet wound because there's no flesh. There's nothing to look at. She just was able to look at the bones, didn't see anything on the bones that said it was a gunshot or broken bones. They found almost all of her skeleton. They found somewhere between 95 and 100% of her skeleton. There were a few bones missing. One including the hyoid bone, which is in your neck. It can be evidence of strangulation. You're going to hear from the medical examiner about how she performed the autopsy, and at the end, you're going to hear that she could not conclude an obvious cause of death for Susana Morales. And that is going to be a significant issue that the defense is going to argue to you. That you cannot find Mr. Bryant guilty of murder because there is no cause of death. I think at the end of the case, you'll be convinced differently. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But once the police identified her remains, they began an investigation. How did she end up here? What you'll hear is that nobody believed that she walked herself out into the woods naked and died there, but that it was at the hands of somebody else. That it was criminal, that it was homicide, that it was murder. And they begin to investigate who is responsible. The very first piece of evidence was found the next day, February 7th of 2023, when the Bryant County Police Department, which you'll hear is that night, they found her body very late in the day, and it became dark very quickly in February. So they secured the scene, they collected what they could, left police officers there to secure the scene, came back the next morning to continue searching. And the next morning, they located this. This is a Glock 19 9mm handgun, and underneath the barrel is an attached flashlight on this weapon. And when they found this weapon very, very close to Susana's body, they became immediately suspicious. There's a gun in the woods near this girl's body. And so they wanted to know who it belonged to. And they found that it was registered to the defendant, Miles Bryant. So they began to do a little more looking. How could this gun end up out there? What they found, and what you'll hear, is that the following morning after she went missing, July 27th of 2022, the defendant called the Bryant County Police Department to report that gun stolen. He claimed that his vehicle had been broken into and that his weapon was stolen from the vehicle. He also claimed that his wallet was stolen from the vehicle at that time. You're going to get to hear that. You'll hear from the officer who took the report. And I want you to remember one important thing. He said to that officer, this is one police officer to another. At the time, he's a police officer. He tells the responding Gwinnett County Police Department officers, just put it on GCIC is stolen. GCIC is the Georgia Crime Information Center. It's where people list stolen things for the police to know. Just, you can put it on there, but I don't want detectives involved. I don't want detectives involved. You don't need to worry about that. To an officer. You'll hear from that officer, Officer Merkley. I'll tell you that was very unusual, especially for a police officer to not want his gun found when it could be picked up and used by somebody else or stolen and used in some other crime, to not want detectives involved in finding it. You're going to hear about cellular tower mapping. You'll hear from Detective Carter. She's going to be the last witness to testify. She's going to talk to you about a lot of different things. But one of the things that she's going to talk to you about is that in her investigation, once they found his gun had been stolen, they thought, well, maybe whoever stole his gun kidnapped her and murdered her. It's reasonable. He lives in the apartment complex where she disappeared from, and he reported his gun stolen the next morning. That would have been a reasonable thought to have. So they continued to investigate and obtained the defendant's cellular phone records. He has two phones. One is a personal phone. The other one is a work phone that is issued by the city of Doraville for his police business. And what you'll see, you'll hear from an expert in cellular tower mapping, Investigator Wilbanks, who will tell you and show you his mapping. This is not his mapping, but he will show you that the defendant's personal phone was located in the woods right next to Susanna's body within 2 hours of her disappearance. Not just that, the defendant's work phone was also located in the woods right after Susanna's disappearance. This location is over 22 miles from the defendant's home and from where Susanna lived. In the middle of the woods in Decatur, Georgia. Nowhere near Norcross. And you'll hear from approximately 12:45 a.m. on the morning of July 27th all the way through 2 a.m. The defendant is right there. He'll give an interview that you'll hear over 3 hours to the police where he discusses this. But his phones place him right next to Susanna's body the night she went missing within a few hours. Putting both him with Susanna and his gun in the woods the night she went missing. It was at that point the police realized that he was not telling the truth about the stolen gun report, because he was right where his gun went missing. And what were the chances that some random person stole his gun and kidnapped the individual, Miss Morales, who disappeared from his apartment complex where he was at, and then he ends up at the exact same location as both her body and the gun. At that point, they significantly suspected him. Ultimately, the defendant is charged with malice murder. That is the count of malice murder. What does it mean? It means he caused the death of Susana Morales with malice in an unknown manner. In many cases, we have gunshot wounds, we have stab wounds, we have injuries that we can point to and say, this is exactly how it happened. This is precisely how the death occurred. And in some cases, we don't. In this case, and in many murder cases, you'll hear that the cause of death is not a material element. It does not have to be proven. And we can think of some examples about why that might be true. Any case where we never recover a body, how would you ever prove the cause of death? This is a significant issue. We charged him in a manner unknown because she doesn't have a cause of death. But what we have to prove is that he was responsible. He did it with malice. What is malice? It doesn't mean hatred. It doesn't mean premeditation. Many states have premeditated murder, first-degree homicide, things like that we're used to hearing on television programs and things. Georgia doesn't have that. We have malice murder and we have felony murder. And in malice murder, it requires that you do it with malice. So what does that mean? That means the intent. You intended to kill this person. That's what it means. The judge will give you a full charge on what malice means at the conclusion of the trial. He is also charged in count 2 with felony murder. Felony murder is defined as causing the death of Susana Morales while committing another felony and in an unknown manner. Felony murder is the idea that if you are committing a felony and in the commission of that felony somebody dies, you are guilty of felony murder. And it can happen in numerous situations. It is a very broad statute. In this case, we are alleging that she died in the commission of him kidnapping her and taking her as she was walking home, her dying, and ending up in the woods. We also charged him with kidnapping, which means to abduct and steal her away without authority to do so. He is a police officer, but you will hear no evidence of him arresting her, no evidence of him lawfully detaining her, no evidence of him doing anything related to the actual furtherance of the duties. Held her against her will, which caused her bodily injury. The bodily injury portion of this is pretty obvious. She's dead. Also, he is charged with criminal attempt to commit rape. Attempted to commit rape by kidnapping her. All it requires is a substantial step. We're not alleging to you that he did in fact follow through and rape her, just that he attempted to do so. In this case, all that is required in order to prove attempted rape is that he had both the intent to do that and he took a substantial step towards doing it. Right? Doesn't mean that he had to follow through all the way, but that he intended to. And you're going to hear things like the fact that she's found completely naked there in the woods. No other explanation for that. You're going to hear that less than 24 hours after the defendant kidnapped and murdered Susana Morales, he was back on shift working as a Doraville Police Department officer. Went into a Quick Trip gas station located in Doraville, Georgia. There behind the counter was a young woman working the counter. She knew the defendant. He would come in there regularly as a police officer on shift in Doraville. He asked to use her phone. Said that his bank account, he couldn't access his bank account on his phone. And so he borrowed her phone, but he didn't access her bank account. He went into her hidden folders on her phone. He selected a pornographic video that she had made of herself, and he sent it to himself. He texted himself her intimate video on her phone. He then deleted the message from her phone to hide any evidence that she was in. Less than 24 hours. This is around 10:30 p.m., July 27th. That night. You're going to hear other evidence. And lastly, you're going to hear a false report, or receive a false report of a crime. This is him falsely reporting to Officer Merkley that his gun was stolen, when he knew very well that it wasn't. And part of that evidence that you'll hear is that right before placing the Gwinnett County Police Department call to report his gun stolen, which occurred around 10:30 in the morning on July 27th, he went back to the scene where Susana's body was found. Went back out to the woods, all the way from Norcross. He got up that morning and he drove his car all the way back the 22 miles to the wooded area. His phone was placed there at around 9:30 in the morning on July 27th. And what you'll hear is that likely he went back to look for his gun that he had dropped in the woods. That gun had a flashlight. At 12 at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, it's pitch black in the middle of the woods. And for whatever reason, he dropped or lost his weapon and went back to look for it. Not finding it, he returned and called the Gwinnett County Police Department to report his stolen. Didn't want detectives involved, but to report it stolen. You're going to hear a charge the judge already read out to you. Reasonable doubt. What is it? What does it mean? The state has a burden, which I gladly accept, of proving this case beyond a reasonable doubt. That he did every one of these things beyond a reasonable doubt. Sometimes it's great to define this in terms of what it's not, and the judge already told you, it is not all doubt. It is not to a mathematical certainty. It is reasonable doubt. Right? The judge used a word that I think embodies this concept the best. It's common sense. You all come in with common sense. You all have common sense. And you are being asked to use your common sense about what happened in this case. And you view the evidence to use your common sense about what occurred in this case. I'm certain that you will hear arguments that, well, we just don't know how she died. We don't know the cause of death, so you can't say that it's murder. Well, when you look at all of the evidence at the conclusion of the case, when you see all of the evidence and everything that happened, I'm going to ask you to use your common sense and conclude that he did these things. And when we talk about another concept, direct evidence and circumstantial evidence.
Your Honor, I hate to interrupt, but at this point he's explaining the law, which I do not think is proper in opening. Opening is to tell the jury what you expect the evidence to show.
Mr. Dilfer?
Judge, I think that I'm permitted a little latitude to explain a few concepts that are going to be important for them to understand for the trial.
I'm going to ask you to move on from this, and I'll explain that to them. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
What happened to Susanna? You are going to be faced with that question. You are going to have to battle amongst yourselves about what happened to her and what proof is there of it. Could it have been an accident? Could she have taken something and overdosed on something and died? Could there be some other explanation for what happened? Well, you don't have to wonder. You're going to hear the defendant tell you. You're going to get to watch over 3 hours of him telling you that he's never seen her before. He's never even laid eyes on her before. Doesn't know her, never seen her. You're going to hear that he had absolutely nothing to do with it. He goes, I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. I don't know her. I've never seen her. I have nothing to do with it. And it's just a complete coincidence that his phones are there at the scene with her, that his gun is found at the scene. This is what you're going to hear from his own mouth. And then you're going to hear that Detective Carter asked him repeatedly, was it an accident? Did she fall and hit her head? No. I don't have anything to do with this. She didn't. Was it an overdose? Did she take something? No. It wasn't any of those things. It wasn't any accident. It wasn't anything. That's what you're going to hear from his own mouth. On February 13th of 2023, when he was interviewed by the police. And you're going to consider that he has told the police and everybody that there is absolutely no other explanation. He didn't do any of this, and none of this was an accident, it wasn't an overdose, and nothing else happened to her. And you're ultimately going to hear that his lies, repeated lie after lie after lie after lie, for 3.5 hours of having nothing to do with this. But the truth will come out. You will see what the truth is. And my job is to convince you beyond reasonable doubt that everything he said to you in that interview is a lie. I love this quote. There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. I expect in this trial that you are going to try and be convinced that something else happened to Susanna. This was an accident, that it was not intentional, he did not do it. Or that if he was involved in it some way, that it was an overdose, because she liked to smoke marijuana. Many of you will hear that one time in her past, she had tried what she called acid. Months before, one time, from her friends. They'll tell you that. I'm about to call them. You'll hear them say it. Maybe you'll be trying to convince that this is something, some accident. And of course, the medical examiner might have been able to give you a much better explanation about any of the things that happened to her if her body had ever been located before 196 days, before her flesh was gone, before all evidence was gone. But I'm going to argue to you at the end of this case that the defendant doesn't get to escape justice because he's good at committing a crime. Because he's good at covering his tracks. He doesn't get to escape justice. And at the conclusion, I'm going to ask you to come back and find the defendant guilty of malice murder, guilty of felony murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of criminal attempt to commit rape, and guilty of false report of a crime.
Does the defense wish to make an opening statement?
Yes.
All right, Ms. Drake.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Still morning. Always have to double check. As the judge has told you, what is said in opening is not evidence. But I want to point out a couple of things. Every death is not a homicide. Every homicide is not malice murder, and it's not felony murder. Now, the state said that I'm going to come up here and try to make all sorts of excuses. I'm not. At the conclusion of this trial, I'm going to come up and tell you, hold this man guilty for what he did during this time. Hold him guilty and responsible for the death of Susanna Morales, but it doesn't fall in any of those categories. It is a tragedy what happened to Susanna Morales. She's a beautiful young lady. I have spoken briefly with members of her family. They're very, very nice. As a mother, I cannot fathom the anguish that they went through. Makes me very upset at Mr. Bryant. But you don't have to like my client. And in fact, at the conclusion of this trial, you're going to think that he is the most callous, uncaring coward that you have ever seen. However, he is not guilty of the murder or felony murder in this particular case. What you have from the state is speculation. We found this, and we don't really know, but this is what we think happened, particularly on the Life 360. They're not going to introduce to you any expert to explain the 360. You hear about it could have been a hard break, but no, they're speculating that it was thrown out of the car. Their whole case is based upon speculation. At the conclusion of the total trial, and you're going to hear from Miles Bryant, he's going to explain to you exactly what happened, and it is going to be supported by all of the evidence that the state is going to introduce to you. They could have done some more testing to possibly determine a cause of death. They did have hair, they did have bone marrow. They did not test any of those. You're not going to hear any evidence. You're not going to hear any evidence that she did not willingly get into his vehicle, or even that that was the only vehicle that she got into that evening. No evidence whatsoever. You saw in his presentation a video of her walking down the road. There's not going to be any video from any of the surrounding businesses to show how, the manner that she got into the vehicle. There's not going to be any evidence of an intense rape That simply did not happen. At the end of this case, you're going to know the full truth. Why Mr. Miles lied to the police and why he reported his gun stolen. And that is not going to be an issue for you. We will concede that at this point. He did make a false report of his gun being stolen. His gun was not stolen. And he's going to explain to you his thinking and why he made that report. At the conclusion, you're going to see that the state's case is based upon outrage, which is warranted, but speculation. You're going to have the actual truth that is supported by all of the evidence. And I can promise you, you are going to hate that young man sitting there. But at the conclusion of this trial, as he's going to come back and ask you to return a verdict of guilty, I'm going to come back up here and tell you it is fine to hate Miles Bryant. You can hate him all you want. However, I'm going to ask you to return a verdict that holds him accountable for his actions, but it's not murder, it's not felony murder, it's not kidnapping, and it's not criminal intent to commit a rape.
You can straight.